When we first started researching the many different trading card games that are out there and how many cards are typically used in a deck, we noticed that the numbers vary considerably, anywhere from 40 to 120 cards in a single deck. On top of that, some people played non-sleeved, single-sleeved, and some even double-sleeved their cards. So that meant that there needed to be even bigger deck box sizes to accommodate these variations. So we created over 20 stencils to meet whatever those needs might be based on whatever type of card game that you're playing. Now, because the stencils go from small to really big, and because we wanted to be able to have you print off your stencil on your own computer at home, the size of the stencil was limited by the 8.5 inch by 11 inch piece of paper that's standard in most home printers. Some of the stencils we could get onto that single page, and we called them one-page, one-piece stencils. Now, once the stencil started getting too big for that, we had to start cutting little ends of them off and kind of putting them off to the side on the same page just so that we could print off the entire stencil on one page. We call those one-page, many-piece stencils. And they just require a little bit of putting back together again when you glue them onto paperboard. We're going to explain how that's done shortly. Finally, for the biggest stencils, we call them two-page, two-piece stencils because, well, they take 2 pages in order to be able to put them together on one piece of paperboard. They're just too big to get on one page. So we're going to also show you how to make those stencils as well. The great thing about this is once all of 3 different kinds of stencils are made, they all still look the same and work the same. So once you understand how one of the stencils works to make a deck box, you'll understand how all of them work. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let's start off with the one-page, one-piece stencil and how to create it after you've printed it off of your printer. We're going to make a one-page, one-piece stencil with this scrap piece of paperboard here. You're going to need a few supplies to do it, like this glue stick, a ruler, a utility knife, a pair of scissors, and of course a cutting board. Once you have those, that's about all you need to get this project started. First of all, grab your ruler and measure the rectangle inside the stencil. Make sure that the length that it is the same as what's written inside of the rectangle. If it is, you're good to go. If not, just follow the instructions written on the stencil for what to do next. Now, if you notice, there's only one instruction for you to follow on here, and that's to do as I'm doing right here and cut out the excess paper. This just means there's that much less paper to glue when you're ready to put it on the paperboard. You don't have to follow the lines exactly. They just give you a rough idea of where to cut. You can cut it more closely if you want, or just as is. So once you're ready, flip it over and start gluing the backside like I'm doing here. Don't worry if you don't get the entire piece of paper glued. Once you've cut out the stencil, there'll be time to glue down any pieces that aren't stuck flat on the paperboard. Once you lay it down there, use your hands to flatten it out as nicely as you can. Try and get any air bubbles out and make sure that everything's glued flat onto the paperboard. Once that's finished, you don't have to wait for it to dry. Just grab your scissors and start cutting it out, taking care to accurately get all the way around the entire stencil, keeping right on the lines, because this is going to be what you're using to draw out your future deck boxes. So you want it nice and accurately cut. You'll notice that there are several little pieces that still haven't been cut yet. Those tiny little areas that are a little bit hard to get at with the scissors, I just saved for the utility knife. Now make sure to put the cutting board underneath the surface when you're cutting up the rest of your stencil with this knife, and just get those hard to reach places, then the little nubs and any other spots that you never got with the scissors. Take your time and go over the entire stencil, making sure you get all the pieces cut off and ready for the next step here. As you finish up the last little bit here, take the time and look over your entire stencil, making sure you got your utility knife in every little nook and cranny and that everything is cut out just the way that you want it. Once that's finished, there's a bunch of little triangles on the inside that you can cut out, as well as the rectangle. Let's start off with the triangles. Using your utility knife, just cut them all out as I'm doing here. They're going to be very important little parts of your deck making process that you're going to learn about shortly if you haven't already seen the video on how the deck boxes are made. So take your time and just cut out every single one of them like I'm doing here, and then we'll get ready for the rectangle next. Now that you have all of the triangles cut out, let's get working on the rectangle next. You can cut it out any way that you like, but the way that I like to do it is I cut down on the vertical side. It doesn't matter which side you choose. And then I come back in about 3 or 4 inches on the horizontal side, and I do the top and the bottom this way. This gives me an opening to get my scissors in so that I can cut across it, as you're going to see pretty soon. Once I've got that finished, then I'll move over to the far end of the rectangle and I'll cut the vertical line as well, so that when the scissors cut down to that end, the piece will just fall out. As you finish cutting out that rectangle, the only thing that's left to do is start tugging on the paper to look for any places that didn't stick down to the paperboard. Like this giant piece right here. For some reason, I guess the glue must have dried by the time I got ready to put it into place. It doesn't matter. Just grab the glue stick, add some extra glue, and then you can just firmly press it all into place like I'm doing right here. It still cleans up quite nice. Once you've got that done, just grab all the different edges, the flaps, and everywhere. Look for any other parts that aren't glued down. Ideally, you want to use your cutting board for doing this so that you don't get any excess glue that comes off of the glue stick onto your countertop, and then it's just one little more extra mess that you have to clean up. Not a huge deal either way. Take your time with this, be thorough, and like I said, try and lightly tug on every possible part of the stencil to make sure that it's entirely covered in glue and firmly pressed against the paperboard. Once you got that finished, give it one more quick look over to make sure that there's no other parts of the stencil that weren't cut out, that there's no pieces that aren't glued back down to the paperboard, and if everything is as it should be, then this one is finished. Next, let's try putting together a one-page many pieces stencil. Now, there are a few different stencils in this category. Some have 2 pieces and some are made out of 3 different pieces. But when you learn how to put one of these together, you'll easily understand how to put any of them together. So let's get started here. Using the same supplies that you used in the first stencil that we made, you're going to get started with this one. Once again, starting off by using your ruler to measure the rectangle and ensuring that the measured distance is the same as the distance shown inside the rectangle. Now there are several instructions written all around this stencil. Make sure to read all of them. And once you're ready, you can start with the first one, which is to start cutting out the extra paper from around the stencil. While I'm cutting this out, I want you to have a look at the bottom corner there, where you can see 2 pieces sitting in right to the right of my thumb. That is the top and the bottom round flap that go on the very top and the very bottom of the deck box. There's a specific way that they need to be cut out because they're going to be glued on after the main body of the stencil is put on the paperboard. That will be explained shortly. So when you get to that part, take your time and cut it out according to how the instructions on there show you how to do it. Once you've got everything cut out, these are what the 2 little pieces in the corner of the stencil page look like. Cut out like this, the top will go on the very top, and naturally the bottom goes on the very bottom. You don't want to get them mixed up. Next, flip over your paperboard and dry fit the entire stencil to make sure that it fits in between the factory folds. You want to try and keep the factory folds away from the stencil when you cut it out, just so that you get a nice flatter stencil. Having factory folds as a part of the stencil tends to make them curl up a bit, and it's just not as nice of a finish. Once you're happy that everything will fit the way it should, flip the stencil over and start getting ready to glue it so that you can put it into place. Using your hands, make sure you get that paper out as flat as you can, removing any wrinkles and air bubbles and so on and so forth. When you're ready, you can grab the bottom piece, or if you like, you can start with the top. It doesn't matter. But grab some glue, put it on the back side, and get ready to put it into place. You want to make sure and line it up perfectly with the markings that are left over on the bottom part of the stencil, like I'm doing here. Once you're happy with the location, press it nice and flat. Make sure that the entire piece is glued down to the paperboard, and then you can get ready for the top piece. Now, if you take a look here, you'll notice that there's some little markings in the corner here. You're going to use those with the markings on the stencil, which I'm going to show you right here. Those line those up with each other, and that'll help to make sure that you get this piece exactly where you want it. Another little trick that you can use as well is the part of the letters C and D on the top and A and B on the bottom are visible on this piece that I'm laying down right now. They will sit down on top of the letters as well, and it'll still look like the same letter. So you have plenty of little marks and guides to use to help you properly line up these pieces on the top and or bottom of the stencil. Once you get it to where you want it, make sure you flatten it out nicely like I'm doing here, getting out any air bubbles or wrinkles, and quickly double checking to make sure it's accurately lined up with the main body of the stencil. Once you finish that, you don't have to wait for it to dry. You can just get started with cutting out the entire stencil. As you can see here, I've placed a stencil on top of the cutting board, and using my utility knife, I'm just cleaning up the little bits and pieces that I missed with the scissors, cutting out the nubs and around the corners of the rounded flaps and anywhere else that needs to be cut out. Kind of cleaning it up, getting it ready for the next step. Once I've got that finished, there are several little triangles that are found within the stencil, and just like in the other stencil we've created so far, we're going to cut all of these triangles out as well. You may have noticed that this is a bigger stencil than the first one that we created, and as such, there are also more triangles to be cut out as well. So this will take a little bit longer, and the rectangle is also getting bigger. This matters because you'll see how I cut it out here momentarily. Sometimes it's just a bit of a fight to find a way to get the scissors in there to start cutting it. Notice how I stopped right in the middle there and left a little piece vertically. The reason I did that was just to give it a little bit more structural strength in case it's going to take some abuse over the next while whenever I make deck boxes out of it. I do this with the bigger stencils, but it's not something that you have to do. It's just a suggestion that you could try out. Once you've got the second triangle cut out, or if you decide to do it as one, you can put those scissors away and grab your glue stick and start tugging away at all the different pieces of paper like this that aren't glued down. Take your time and glue them back into place so that you get one nice firm stencil with no stray pieces of paper flapping in the wind. After you get this finished, give it one more quick look over to make sure that nothing was missed, and you've got your second stencil complete. Now it's time to get started in the last of the 3 different stencil types, the 2-page, 2-pieces stencil. This is how we created them. As I lay down both pages, notice how there are 7 different sets of instructions printed out along with the stencil. You can read them when you're ready to start creating your own. Just follow them as they show. Of course, one of the first things you're going to do is grab your ruler and measure out the rectangle based on the measurement written inside of the rectangle itself. If that's correct, then you can start moving on to the next step, which is cutting out the stencil. You want to make sure to get all the excess paper off so that you have that much less to glue onto the paperboard. Now with these 2-page stencils, you got to be a little bit more careful with the way that you're cutting. And we recommend that you follow the dotted lines that kind of go around the entire outside of the stencil. As you can see here, I'm still leaving a little bit of room around the outside of this half of the stencil so that I can do the nice final cut after it's been glued onto the paperboard. When you're ready to start cutting the second page, it's going pretty much the same as the first page until you get to this one side. And as you'll notice here, once I start cutting it, that I'm going to need to very carefully cut along the line itself on the outside edge of the stencil. I want to cut that exactly on the line the whole way down. And this is going to matter shortly. So for now, just trust me and make sure that when you get to this step, you're cutting it the same way that I am. Now that you've got both pieces cut, we can lay them down and kind of dry fit them on the paperboard here. Notice how I'm pointing at the faded glue flap on the left side of the right piece of paper. That is the glue flap that's actually found on the right side of the left piece of paper. We left it on there so that you had something to use as a reference for how to line up both pieces of paper when it's time to combine them together. There's also a few other marks as well that you can use for reference. The way that this is done is to make sure that the left piece of paper is put on top of the right-hand piece of paper, right where that little glue flap is, as you can see that I'm doing here. This is also why you wanted to cut down the one side right on the line of the stencil as seen in the left piece of paper. Once you've dry fitted that, understanding how it all fits together, you can flip over the right side piece of paper first and glue it for putting onto the paperboard. As I'm finishing up gluing the back side of this piece of paper. I didn't bother putting any on the rectangle since I'll be cutting it out anyways. Once I was ready to flip it over, because the piece of paperboard I have is fairly small, I used the other piece to help guide where to put this first glued piece. And then using my hands, spread it out nice and flat, making sure once again to get all of the wrinkles and air bubbles out and having all of the corners nice and flat, glued to the paperboard. Once in place, I quickly check all four corners to make sure that they're all glued down, especially the left-hand side, because the left piece of paper that I'm holding is going to be glued down on top of it shortly. Once I'm ready, I flip over the other piece of paper and start gluing it so that I can put it into place. As I lay it down on top of the right-hand piece of paper, I'm trying to line up all the markers that are there for me, guiding me to put this the way it needs to be, including the glue flaps, making sure that horizontally they line up and also vertically as well. I'm taking my time to get this part right. Once I'm happy with it, I can flatten everything out, just like I've explained the previous times. Now, the difference with this stencil is I'm doing something that I don't normally do. What I'm actually doing is putting a part of the stencil over top of a factory fold. And it's something that I discourage, but I did in this video just so you can see what happens when you do that. After I finished cleaning up all the areas that didn't hold the paper down with some extra glue, including the bottom piece here, I think I waited too long trying to set it into place and the glue just kind of dried. Either way, as you can see, it's ready for cutting, and I have a factory fold underneath the paper, which is not something that I like, but you'll understand here momentarily. Once that's all finished, you can start cutting out your stencil. When you've got extra paperboard kicking around like this, I like to cut off the big extra chunks first, just to get it out of the way, and then I can start doing the finer cutting. But the choice is yours. Do it any way you like. Once again, cutting whatever I can, and any little pieces that are hard to get with the scissors, or that are just kind of a pain in the butt, like the little nubs and pieces around the rounded flaps, I'm just going to leave that for the utility knife after I'm done cutting out the main parts of the stencil. Once you're done with the scissors, get out your cutting board and utility knife and start on those little bits and pieces that you couldn't get with your scissors or didn't quite finish with them. Take your time going all the way around the stencil, making sure you get everything and cleaning it up nice and neatly. Then you can get it ready for the next step, which, as you probably already know, is cutting out the triangles. And when you're ready, just start cutting out all of the triangles like I'm doing here with your utility knife. Once again, making sure that you have your cutting board underneath. Take your time and do a nice neat job with this so that you have nice, neat, crisp triangles in your final stencil. Once the triangles are all finished, it's time to cut out the big rectangle. As you can see with this design, I'm actually going to be cutting out two separate little rectangles, leaving that strip in the middle again so that the entire stencil has a bit more structural support. Once that's finished, we'll get on to the final step. As I struggle to get the scissors in there and cut out the first rectangle, take a look at the bottom part of the stencil. You can see where the factory fold has been glued under the piece of paper. Notice how it causes the rest of the bottom to stick up higher than the rest of the stencil. It's not a huge deal, and it'll still trace out just fine as if there isn't a factory fold there. It's the fact that it deforms the stencil in the way that it does that we recommend not using any part of the paperboard that has a factory fold underneath the stencil. Now that the rectangles have both been cut out, put your stencil on top of your cutting board and start tugging away at all the different corners and edges of your stencil to see if there's any pieces of paper that aren't glued down to the paperboard. As you find each of the little pieces, simply glue them back into place again. Once again, I use the cutting board so that if there's any glue that gets scraped off, it's going to go onto the cutting board instead of onto the table. Just one of those things that means there's that much less to clean up after I'm finished. As I finish gluing up the rest of the stencil, I'm also quickly looking it over to make sure that there aren't any extra little bits and pieces that I missed with the scissors or the utility knife, and just checking to make sure that the stencil is completed. Once I'm happy with that, then the stencil can be considered finished. That's all there is for this video on how to make the different kinds of stencils. Next, there's a few videos that you can watch that show you how to make the different kinds of boxes that are possible with the different stencils that we have here. Thank you for watching.